It's good to be with you all this morning. If you have a copy of God's Word with you, go ahead and turn or click or however you want to do it there to Genesis chapter 22. I don't know if you know this, but Genesis chapter 22 is actually was actually highlighted in a newspaper, the Telegraph of London, highlighted Genesis chapter 22 as number 8 in its list of the top 10 worst Bible passages. Popular atheist and magician Penn Jillette referred to this same passage as one of the passages that convinced him to reject the God of the Bible. The famed atheist and author Christopher Hitchens said of this passage, "I find a father holding a knife to a son's throat to show his love to a totalitarian dictator wicked." Right, so for many, this passage provokes strong feelings and challenges to their view of God, challenges to what we believe about God, his trustworthiness, and even his worthiness to be worshiped. Maybe we, as followers of Christ, don't feel compelled to abandon our belief in God, but I think even Christians can come at a passage like this, and if we're honest, we feel perplexed, confused even. We might find ourselves wondering, can God be trustworthy and worthy of our worship in light of what we find in a passage like this? I mean, it seems like such a strange text, one that seems to fly in the face of so much of who we understand God to be and what he's commanded and what he himself has done for Abraham and what he has promised to do for Abraham. Of course, the irony in such questions is that those are the very questions that this test is meant to prompt and provoke. These are the very challenges in questions that Abraham himself was faced with, and that is no accident. That the test that we find here in this chapter was not meant to undermine God's faithfulness in his goodness, but to test Abraham's own confidence in God's faithfulness and his goodness. To test whether or not he would trust God and treasure him even in the most perplexing and difficult circumstances. Of course, if we're going to read the events of this chapter, we have to read it in light of everything that's come before. This is a pivotal moment for Abraham. One might say that it is the climax of his life. Right? This is the moment that in some ways everything we've read up until this point has been moving towards. Abraham's life has been a life of faith so far, a life lived waiting and hoping and trusting God to provide all of those things that God has promised. It's also been a life, as we've seen, of ups and downs, right? A life where Abraham and his own wife have struggled to trust God fully and to treasure him above the things around them, especially in those difficult moments of uncertainty in their lives. I think in all of this, God has been patient, has he not? He has been patient as he's proved his faithfulness and his trustworthiness and his supremacy to Abraham and his wife time and time and time again, even in their own failures. With the birth of Isaac in the previous chapter, it seems as though God's promises are finally beginning to materialize. Right? There's an excitement here. But before I think things can move further, there's a few important questions that remain. One, has Abraham finally learned to truly trust God, to truly treasure him completely? And if so, is God going to continue to show himself to be faithful to Abraham, even in the most difficult circumstances? And I think as we think about those questions and we look to our passage, this is a passage that aims to answer those questions for us. So if you will, read along with me, starting in verse 1. After these things, God tested Abraham, right? It's right there at the beginning, and said to him, "Abraham," and he said, "Here I am." He said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you." So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes, and he saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you." And And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering, and he laid it on Isaac his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, "My father." And he said, "Here I am, my son." He said, "Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." So they went both of them together. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there, and he laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand, and he took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." He said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing as you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and he took the ram and he offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, "The Lord will provide." As it is said to this day, "On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, "By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this, and you have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of the heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore, and your offspring shall possess the gates of his enemies. And in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba. Now after these things it was told to Abraham, "Behold, Milcah also bore to your children, to your brother Nahor, Uz his firstborn, Buz his brother, Kemuel the father of Aram, Chesed, Hazo, Pildash, Jidlaph, and Bethuel. And Bethuel fathered Rebekah. These 8 Milcah bore to Nahor, Abraham's brother. Moreover, his concubine, whose name was Ramah, bore Tebah, Gaham, Tahash, and Maacah. Well, from a narrative kind of perspective, right, the events of this passage are really kind of interesting in that they follow that sort of classic story structure. Maybe you've heard of the mountain story, the story mountain before. If you've ever kind of looked into literature, right? It's that idea that the best stories kind of contain the same plot points. And this story is no different, right? It is a classic case of that story mountain that you see in literature. Only in this case, what's even more remarkable is that those plot points can be traced literally through this journey up a mountain. And we have an inciting incident or conflict on one side of the mountain in God's call to offer up Isaac. We have that rising tension in Abraham's journey to the mountain and even up the mountain with Isaac, wondering what is going to happen. And then, of course, as they reach the precipice of the mountain, we come to the climax of the moment and of the story as Abraham prepares to sacrifice Isaac, only for God to step in and to ease that tension with the resolution to our story. And then, of course, we have that sort of falling action as God confirms his promises with an oath. And Abraham journeys back home, a different man, quite literally. And we have an epilogue then even of sorts, where we're told details about Abraham's brother Nahor. And I think this is an interesting thing for us to note. But I think as we step back and we look at all of these events, at this story that is being told to us here, I think we find really, I think, 2 simple demonstrations. Just to kind of simplify for us what is happening here. I think there are really 2 things that this text is communicating to us. It wants us first to look at this test of Abraham's faith, of his response to this call, a response that shows that his faith in God is solid, that he truly trusts God and treasures him above all things. And then in response, I think the rest of this text, right, it is showing us that God is who Abraham believes him to be. That he is that trustworthy God who is worthy of Abraham's worship. And at its core, this is a story that is meant to show us that God is trustworthy, that he is worthy of our worship, even in the most challenging of circumstances. That's who Abraham believes him to be, and that's who God proves himself to be. I think that's the main thrust of this passage for us this morning, that we are to recognize that God is trustworthy and worthy of our worship, even in the most challenging of circumstances. That's the lesson that Abraham is to take away from this moment, and it's the same lesson that we're to take away. And so as we unpack this, we're going to look simply at Abraham's own testing of his faith. We're going to look at how this trial tests his faith and reveals it. And then we're going to look at God's own response and how God's response here proves his faithfulness to Abraham and to us. So looking there first at Abraham's faith and the testing of Abraham's faith here in this trial. And I think the first thing to recognize here is that when we look at this call from God, this call to offer up Isaac, well, it really did serve as a kind of challenge to Abraham's trust and his treasuring of God. This is what we tend to find most perplexing about this passage. Now, this is a moment in which God is commanding Abraham in verses 1 and 2 to do something that seemingly raises significant questions about God. Significant questions about God, but questions, I think, friends, that God has already provided answers for in Abraham's own life. For one, look at the way that this call to offer up Isaac, it challenges Abraham's confidence in what God had previously promised to provide for him, right? Throughout this story, in our study of Abraham's life, we've seen from back in chapter 12 till now, this repeated emphasis on God's promise to bless him, to make his name great, to give him not just a son, but a son through which a whole nation and kingdom and people will come. And not just any kingdom, but that kingdom that is to reflect God's own character and to mediate his own redemptive purposes. A people through whom the nations will be blessed. And that son is here, right? He's finally come, and yet just as things seem to be getting somewhere for Abraham, God shows up and says, all right, now I want you to offer up that son of promise, the one you've been waiting for, the one through whom these promises are to come. I mean, this is a direct challenge to what God has promised by God himself, the one who has promised to do this through this son. And it would be understandable for Abraham to think of this call and to ask himself, are you going back on those promises? Are you changing your mind? Have you decided that those promises are not going to be fulfilled? But if we've been following Abraham's story, then like him, at this point, we should be screaming, that can't possibly be true. God has worked diligently to teach Abraham that God's purposes and promises cannot be stopped. That nothing will stop those promises. Time and again, he has demonstrated that nothing will undermine those promises. Like so much of Abraham's life has been designed to teach him that very thing and to teach us that. And so as we ask that question, we should, whatever we think is happening, be able to say, there's no way. At the same time, it raises questions about God's power to provide what he's promised. God may not be going back on his promises, but all right, well, what's he doing? Right? If Abraham follows through with what he's asking, how will God make a way for his promises to be fulfilled? I mean, if Isaac is dead, there's no future here for these promises. Abraham is, I think, hearing this call, and perhaps he's thinking to himself, can God still make a way if I follow through with this? Can God provide what he has promised if I do what he's asking me to do? And the answer, of course, friends, again, has already been given to us. Of course he can. Somehow he will. He has proven time and again that he is able to make a way. After all, is nothing too hard for the Lord? Even still, we might think, how can God ask Abraham to do this? I mean, doesn't this fly in the face of God's own character and his commands? Is God a God who would really require such a thing? Is God truly just? And have we gotten an answer to that question before? Of course we have. Again, this question has been made clear to Abraham and to us. Will not the judge of all the earth do what is right? At the same time, I think this test, it is designed not just to challenge Abraham's confidence in God, but to test his treasuring of God. Now that Isaac is here, I think the question is, will Abraham decide that this son is worth more to him than anything else? Isaac is here. Abraham has gotten what he wants from God. Does he still care to follow God, to wait on God? Or will he put his hopes and his heart into Isaac instead? Is God supremely valuable to Abraham, or is he just a means to an end? And I think as Abraham is faced with the thought of giving up his own son, the son whom he loves, God is calling out and challenging his own treasuring of God himself. Is obeying God worth more than Isaac? Is fearing God worth more than fearing the loss of Isaac? And again, time and time again, God has shown himself to be worthy of Abraham's devotion. That he is a God worthy of not just his trust, but his worship. And friends, when we think about this and we have all these questions about a passage like this, and we think everything in this seems to be screaming against what God has shown, that's the point. That's precisely the point. It is a test. We're told that up front in no uncertain terms, a test designed to put pressure on these very questions. Does Abraham still believe that God is trustworthy, that he is worthy? Has God made that clear enough to him already? And that's important for us to see. It's important for us to see that God is the one who is raising these very questions and concerns in this passage. And at the same time, he is the one who creates similar circumstances and trials in our own lives. He raises some of these same kinds of questions for us as we think about our own difficult circumstances. Oftentimes, God puts us through tests, and he's not going to ask us to sacrifice our children, but he may call us to give up things that matter. He may take away things we value. He may upend our plans and our expectations. He may put us through trials that seem perplexing and discouraging. He may put us in situations that challenge our confidence in him and challenge what we truly value. And friends, he does that not because he's trying to confuse us or to tempt us to sin or to turn from him, but he does so to refine our trust in him and our treasuring of him, to produce greater confidence that our faith in him is solid, that he is worthy of our worship, even in the most difficult circumstances, even when we don't understand what is going on in our lives. So I think rather than growing disillusioned and discouraged or bitter, we need to lean into these moments and these seasons and allow them to have their full effect. They are not an accident. Abraham does that. He leans into these trials that are in a way that I think seems surprising. He's eager to obey God. Here I am. Literally, the phrase Abraham uses is the same phrase that Isaiah uses. Like, who will I send? Here I am. I'm ready, God. Throughout this, he does obey God in ways that demonstrate just how much he does trust and treasure God. And think about the way that he demonstrates his trust in God's promises. And we see this in a key way there in verse 5. Look at what he says to those young men. Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come back to you. What's significant here is that each step of this statement, Abraham is using a first-person sort of plural form of these verbs. Sounds nerdy, but it's amazing. Because if you read this in Hebrew, the emphasis is clear. I and the boy will go, I and the boy will worship, and I and the boy will come again to you. Do you hear that? I and the boy will come again to you. No matter what Abraham thinks is going to happen here, at no point does he question whether or not this child is coming back with him, whether or not God's promises will hold. Whatever happens, Isaac is coming back, and God's promises and purposes will not fail. And he demonstrates that same confidence to Isaac himself, confidence that God will provide. What does he say to him in verses 7 and 8? When Isaac asks him, where is that sacrifice? God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. I don't think Abraham's just, I don't want to tell him what's going to happen. I don't think that's what's happening here, friends. I think he's confident. Like, he doesn't quite know what's going to happen. He is reasoning by faith. Like, God's going to do something. God's going to provide. He's going to see to this situation. I just have to keep doing what He's told me to do. We don't have to worry. God will provide a way forward. He's done it time and again. And as he reached that mountain, he began to prepare that altar. It seemed, where's the provision coming? And yet he doesn't wait. He doesn't waver. And the text just slows to a crawl. Right? He stacks the wood. He grabs the knife. He reaches out. And at that moment, even when we are thinking, is this really going to happen? Even then, Abraham is confident that God would provide a way forward. Even if that means that he has to go through with this, that God must be powerful enough to provide what he has promised, even if that means raising Isaac from the dead. That's what the author of Hebrews tells us in Hebrews 11, 17, 19. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received these promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. And he considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. His confidence in God is so full. God, I guess if you're going to have me go through with this, you're going to have to bring this kid back from the dead, because you're not going to fail to do what you said you're going to do. And you must be capable of that. And his confidence in each of these instances shows a kind of faith that trusts that God will work in ways that are consistent with his promises and his character. There's no version of this situation in which Abraham buys into the idea that God is simply turning his back on everything that he's said to Abraham up until this point. Nothing like that. But the end result is that Abraham demonstrates not only that he trusts God, but that he treasures him above all things. I mean, think about what God says to him when he steps in. Abraham, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing as you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. The fear here, it's not a fear of what would happen to him if he didn't do what God told him to do. God's going to get me. It's a fear of not valuing God as God, of treasuring Isaac more than he treasured God, of fearing losing Isaac more than he feared not doing what his God had called him to do. Right? To be one who fears God in the Bible is not to be afraid of God, but it is to feel a right sense of his weight and his worth as our Creator. To say he is worthy of our worship because he has made us. He is worthy. In his willingness to not withhold this son whom he loved, Abraham revealed that he treasured God above even good things that God had given him. And in that, the test is passed. And Abraham's faith is shown to be solid. His trust in God is revealed as genuine, and his treasuring of God is supreme. Of course, the question here is not a question so much that God needed answered. Right? God knows the heart. We saw that in God's interaction with Sarah. God thinking about the issue here is not for God to figure out whether or not Abraham really is someone who trusts him and treasures him, but the issue here is to show Abraham himself whether or not he truly believes that, and to show us what that kind of solid faith looks like. I think as we think of our own lives and we think about our own trust in God, we think about our own difficult circumstances, the question for us is, do we trust God and treasure him in this kind of way? Is our faith solid? Is there substance to it? Or does it just evaporate under the slightest bit of heat? Like, does it hold up in these moments? Like Abraham, are we willing to put one foot in front of the other and keep walking forward in obedience to God, even in the most difficult and perplexing moments? Do we trust him in those trials? Do we trust that his promises are still true, even when it seems like they can't be? Do we trust that his provision is still unwavering, even when we feel like we're receiving nothing? And do we trust that his power is sufficient when there seems like there's no way forward? And do we trust that he is just, that his goodness is never ending, even when that doesn't make sense? Is he worth more than our comfort, more than the things we love, even the good things that he's given us? Are we, like Abraham and the Apostle Paul, willing to suffer the loss of all things for the surpassing worth of knowing Jesus as our Lord? And is he good and worthy of our worship, even in those moments where everything seems to be taken away from us? Friends, I think if we look to those questions, the scary thing is we wonder, well, if I do trust him and I treasure him, what if he doesn't come through? But that's what it means to trust and to treasure him. To believe that he is who we believe him to be, that he will do what he has promised to do. And the good news is that when we trust him and we treasure him, even in those moments, he will not let us down. He will show us that he is who we believed him to be, that he does what we trusted him to do. He will reward that faith by showing himself to be faithful. And that's exactly what happens here. In many ways, if this passage was simply meant to demonstrate Abraham's faith, we might get to verse 12 and God steps in and says, okay, stop. Don't touch him. You've passed the test. You've shown me that you trust me and you treasure me. Now you can go home. Makes sense? But that's not what happens. God responds not by sending Abraham home, but by demonstrating his own faithfulness, by providing all that Abraham was hoping for and more. First, God proves his faithfulness to Abraham by providing a sacrificial substitute to take Isaac's place. Look at verses 13 and 14 again. Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the place, "The Lord will provide." As it is said to this day, "On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." I think before we can appreciate the significance of what God is providing, I think an important question to ask is, if Abraham has passed the test, why does he need a substitute? Right? If God had no intention of Abraham actually sacrificing Isaac, why provide a substitute? Couldn't God just say, all right, I didn't actually intend for you to do this. You passed the test, go home, nothing else is needed, right? But in fact, he does provide a substitute. And that is important because it tells us something about Isaac and Abraham and us. It reveals a need and a reality that has been hanging over all of this book since chapter 3. And what is that reality? It is the reality of death. And what did we see all the way back in chapter 3? What was the result of that rebellion, that sentence and curse of death that now hangs over all people, even God's people? In fact, it's only been God's mercy in which that sentence of death has been belayed, that death has not been required of all, that life has been preserved in order for God to accomplish his purposes. And so the fact remains that when we come to a text like this, the question we should be asking is not, why would God require the life of Isaac? It's, why would God not require the life of everyone we've read up until this point? In requiring Isaac's life, God is reminding Abraham of that curse of death. And by providing a substitute to take his place, God is demonstrating his plans and his purposes to redeem his people from that curse by providing a substitute in their place. That's where these promises and purposes for Isaac are heading after all. The whole future that God has promised, it's not just a future of a nice name and a nice people and a nice place. Right? God is doing something. He is doing something through all of this. And that something that God is doing is bringing redemption and salvation and a restoration of his people from this very curse. And so it's fitting that God would demonstrate to Abraham that these future purposes hinge on the need for a substitute. That even Isaac is under that curse of death, that even Isaac needs a substitute. It's something God communicates again in the Passover to the Israelites when he promises to come and visit judgment on the Egyptians and tells them, you need a substitute or else you will also suffer judgment. And God has promised Abraham that his offspring through Isaac will be the means by which he redeems the nations, but that provision of a substitute is what is necessary for that to happen. If God's purposes are going to be accomplished, God's people need a substitute to redeem them from that curse of death. Everything God is doing hangs on this moment. Unless a substitute is provided for Isaac, then God's purposes will not be accomplished. That's intentional. In the same way, this fearful moment and this faithful provision are a reminder to us of our own fate, that we too are under that curse, that we too have that need, that we need a substitute. The question for us, friends, is not whether or not God is going to require our lives from us. He will. All of us will die. All of us. The question is, will we recognize our need for a substitute, for someone to take our place and take on that curse? And I hope, even in this, that we're starting to see that God's not just providing a ram for Isaac. He is providing a clear picture of the gospel. A clear picture of the gospel. This passage is filled with so much gospel imagery, it's hard to even wrap your head around it. Think of the numerous ways that the gospel is pictured. There's, of course, that ram, that substitute, a perfect, spotless sacrifice who is meant to take Isaac's place, who is provided by God. A ram who, nonetheless, is snared in a thicket, a crown of thorns encircling his head. Thorns that are capturing him and leading him to his death, a death where he will be offered as a substitute in place of Isaac to rescue him from death. A ram who pointed to that Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, that true and better substitute, who is a willing substitute provided by God to take our place and bear our curse. And of course, there's Isaac himself. Not only does he kind of serve as a picture of us and our need, but he serves a kind of double duty here. He's also, I think, a picture of Christ, that true and better Isaac, the humble and obedient son of sacrifice, the one who bears the wood of sacrifice on his back as he walks up that fearful mountain towards death, and then who is placed on that same wood to be an offering consumed. The only and beloved Son of that Father, the long-awaited and promised Son, the hope of God's people, now laid upon an altar to die. The one whose birth was celebrated, and yet now who seems to only have been born to die. And yet, one who is raised up to secure a future for God's people and his promises. And then there's the mountain. Moriah, this mount of God's provision, located in what would later become the city of Jerusalem, a mountain that would itself become Mount Zion, the place of God's people and his temple and his glory, and the same mountain that would become Mount Calvary, the place of another sacrifice, of that site of the cross, of that other altar of wood that was borne up, where God himself, as the Father, would offer his only Son, the Son whom he loved, only this time those cries for death would not be silenced. As R.C. Sproul says, this time nobody would holler stop. Nobody would stay God's hand from bringing down the knife, and that beloved Son would die, so that Abraham and Isaac and you and I might live. Here in this moment of Abraham's life, God is providing not just a test of Abraham's faith, but a picture of God's own faithfulness to the gospel, his own faithfulness to provide for the salvation of his own people in this substitute of his own beloved Son in our place. Friends, many have read this passage and concluded that God is a monster, that a God who would ask this of someone can't be trustworthy or worthy to be worshipped, but in doing so, they have missed the key picture here of God's faithfulness that this test was eventually meant to portray. A picture not of God, a God who demands our death, but of a God who has given up his own Son to free us from death. And if you don't know God, I want you to see that picture this morning. I want you to see in this passage a God who is faithful, a God who has provided his Son to take your place, to live the life of perfect obedience that you and I have not lived, to die the death that we deserve in our place, that we might be raised up in life. That's the gospel. And if that's you, then the call here for you this morning is simple. Trust in him. Turn to him and treasure him as your Lord and your Savior. He is worth it. He is trustworthy. I think for those of us who have put our trust in him, at this picture of the gospel, it's just such a wonderful reminder that our confidence that God will provide, well, it is rooted in the gospel. And if we struggle in those moments of our lives to wonder, is God still for me? Will he provide? Will he care for me? Like, we can look at this text and we can know, no matter what is going on, no matter what we are facing, God will provide. He will be for us. He will provide what we need because he's already taken care of our greatest need by providing us his own Son to take our place. And if that were not enough, right, God just piles on. Our passage closes with even more assurances and glimpses of God's faithfulness. Not only does God provide this substitute and this picture of the gospel, but he provides this secure encouragement and hope for Abraham and Isaac's future. Look at verses 15 and 18. The Lord says to Abraham, "By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you. I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and the sand that is on the seashore, and your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." Abraham's confidence in God is rewarded with a set of promises and assurances that I think remove any and all remaining possible doubt that God will do for Abraham what he has promised to do. Not only does God repeat those same promises we've seen time and again, but he builds on them and ratifies them in the highest way possible by making an oath, by swearing even by himself. We might ask, why is that important? Kids, have your parents ever said, don't swear to God? God swears to himself. And that's significant. Abraham has already shown that he trusts God, that he believes that God will be faithful. So why does God need to reiterate those promises? And why does he bolster those promises with this bold oath? And again, I think this is where the author of Hebrews helps us so much. When God made a promise to Abraham, since he had no one greater by whom he could swear, as though if he could, he would, he swore by himself. For people swear by something greater than themselves, and in all their disputes, an oath is final for confirmation. So when God desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of his purpose, he guaranteed it with an oath, so that by two unchangeable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled for refuge might have strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope set before us. In other words, he is providing these promises and this oath to encourage Abraham and give him an unshakable confidence that his future is secure. That's what hope is, that God will do what he has promised for us in the future, that nothing, even God himself, will undermine these promises. That these promises are backed by the security and the assurance of God's own unchangeableness and his own worth and value. I love the way one pastor puts it. What God is saying by swearing by himself is that it is as unlikely that he will break his promise to bless us as it is that he will grow to despise himself. If God is the greatest value in the universe, there is nothing more valuable and wonderful than God. So God swears by himself. And in doing so, he says, I mean for you to have as much confidence in me as it is possible to have. As it is completely possible to have. And he means for us to have that same encouragement and confidence. Did you notice that the author of Hebrews said that it is for we who have fled to him for refuge, that we would have that same encouragement. That's the faithfulness of our God. That we would walk away from this passage not wondering, is God trustworthy? Will he do what he's promised? Is he really good? But that we would walk away with the most possible sense of encouragement that God is trustworthy, that his promises will not fail. And just to top all of it off, the passage closes with one last glimpse into God's faithfulness, his faithfulness to provide a future for these people. We're told in verses 20 through 24 that Abraham has received news after these events of Nahor, his brother, that Nahor has become a father and even a grandfather in the time since Abraham has left. You might think, what? Okay, it's great. A lot of names here. But did you notice that one important name in that list? And Nahor has had a son named Bethuel, and through him, he has had a granddaughter named Rebekah. And as we'll soon find out, Rebekah is to become Isaac's own wife and the mother of his children, Jacob and Esau. So even as Abraham has been busy sojourning in this land, waiting and hoping on this promised son, enduring this trial, he comes back and he received news that God has been preparing for this son, a wife for him, a wife through whom God's people and his promises will come. It's just one tiny way in which God is showing again his faithfulness to provide for Abraham in ways he couldn't possibly foresee. My friends, in his response here to Abraham's tested faith, God shows himself to be faithful and worthy of Abraham's worship. He shows himself to be the God that Abraham believed him to be, a God who's worthy of his trust and worthy to be treasured. I think as we look at this passage, the same can be true for us as we think of God's own faithfulness proven to us here. Far from being repulsed by God, as we read a passage like this, we can and we should marvel at his faithfulness and his worthiness. Far from undermining our confidence in him and our love for him, this passage is a shining example of why he is worthy of our trust and our worship, even in those challenging moments. The question for us this morning is not whether or not God will do what he said he will do, whether or not he is trustworthy or faithful. The question is whether or not we will trust him, whether or not we will treasure him, whether or not we will bank on him proving himself to be faithful. And of course, if we've been reading this story like Abraham, we should say, of course, he's trustworthy. Of course, time and time again, he's proven himself to be faithful and worthy of our worship. And so as we think of this story, that is what we, I think, are to be encouraged by. God is trustworthy. He is worthy. Do you believe that? I hope you do. Will you bow your heads and pray with me? Father, we just confess that so often what we approve of, what we think in terms of our own wisdom when we approach passages like this, God, our questions, God, and we think ourselves to be so superior to you, so wise in our judgments and our assessments of you, and yet, God, as we are honest, as we are careful to see what it is you are doing here, God, you not only show us to be wrong, but you show yourself to be vindicated. Time and again, you've proven your faithfulness. Time and again, you have given us every reason to trust you. And yet we still struggle. God, would you help us come to that full assurance of faith, of that full confidence, trusting you completely and treasuring you above all else. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.